From ABC Radio Hobart, Drive with Gary Magnuson.
Well, how many buildings are there in Australia? That question can now be answered because a company called PSMA, this is an unlisted company owned by the governments of Australia, PSMA has mapped every building across our continent's 7.6 million square kilometres. We're joined by Dan Paull, who is the CEO of PSMA Australia. Dan Paull, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Gary. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Before we reveal the magic number, can you tell me, first of all, why did we need to map every building across our continent?
You know, the data is playing a more and more important role in everyday life. And in fact, you and many of your listeners have probably used mapping data in some form or other as part of their daily routine today, and on most days. But what's interesting is that there isn't a lot known at a national level about all the buildings in the country. And given that this is kind of our area of expertise, we felt that it was something that needed to be addressed. And so we wanted to find a method that would allow us to capture every building and information about every single building across the country so that it could better inform the decision-making that goes on all the time across the country.
Okay, well, I haven't got a drum roll, but what is the magic number?
Well, I love it when I'm asked this question, and I've now memorised that it is 15,243,669 buildings. Now, that's every building greater than 9 square metres, so that's capturing everything right down to a garden shed.
Right, and this is...
Yes, something that was very important to us was to make sure that this was truly national. We wanted to capture every building across the whole of the country, and that's what we've managed to achieve. And in every populated area, and so that's areas greater than 200 people in population terms, we've also captured a range of information about the building height, about the roof materials, about whether that building carries a solar panel or it has a swimming pool adjacent. And we've also captured a range of information about the vegetation and land cover that surrounds those buildings as well.
So these data sets, what are they telling us, for example, when it comes to high-rise buildings in Australia?
Well, it's probably no surprise that the highest building is actually in Melbourne, in Victoria, and it's the tower there that most people would know as Eureka Tower. There is some argument over whether there's a taller building in Queensland. However, the spire is not visible using the techniques that we've used to capture the buildings across the country. So the jury's still out on that one.
And in terms of data sets, when it comes to high-rise buildings, we're in the top 10.
Absolutely. You are indeed. We have done a pretty good job, too, in terms of the scale of buildings, the surface area of the roof, for instance. We have fairly large buildings in that category as well. In fact, the largest building, 187,490 square metres, is actually Tullamarine Airport. And so it's the largest single roof that we have in the country as well.
Right. And when it comes to Tasmania, there were a couple of interesting findings.
Tasmania is a really interesting case because what we see is a really interesting mix between the number of people, the population, and the number of buildings. So, for instance, just over 500,000 buildings, and interestingly, just over 500,000 people. And so that relationship between population and building numbers is actually unusual for Australia as a whole. We would normally expect there to be a higher number, significantly higher, about 1.6 people per building on average across the country. And so there's a higher proportion of buildings in Tasmania than you would expect.
Okay. And you found our most environmental suburb was Sandy Bay.
Yes, indeed.
How did you determine that?
Well, we use a whole range of techniques, and so quite often when you can see a whole variety of things, such as whether or not a property has solar panels and what proportion of vegetation cover there is, they all go into the mix for being able to determine categorisations such as these. And Another interesting fact, which probably won't be a surprise to many of the listeners, is that Tasmania actually has the least number of swimming pools per building in the country.
Yeah, next stop Antarctica, that is no surprise. Fair enough. Look, just to summarise, what will governments now be doing with this information?
Well, this information is commercially available to anyone who believes that they can put it to good use, and at the moment we're seeing some really interesting and I think quite valuable things being done. For instance, in Queensland we're seeing some work being done by local government to improve flood mapping for flood prevention, or at least preparing the community for floods as they come through. We're also seeing it being used to identify buildings that might need closer inspection from a fire rating point of view. So for cladding materials, the requirements that have been allocated are based on building type and building height. And a lot of that information can be sourced directly from Geoscape, the product that we've developed.
Mm. And what sort of price, what sort of return are you getting for the information?
It probably won't be a surprise that it's been an expensive undertaking, but one of the great things about the new techniques that we've applied in this instance is that we have been able to dramatically reduce the cost of capturing this information. And we've done that by using some machine learning, some artificial intelligence, if you like, along with cloud computing and high-resolution satellite imagery. And we're actually able to use the computers to recognise and extract the shape and location of all the buildings. Otherwise, this would be an undertaking that... This price now brings it down to the point where local governments are able to access it, whereas before they would not have been able to.
Okay, so we may get some better planning.
I think it'll certainly improve a whole range of decisions, including planning decisions across the country.
Dan, thanks for your time this afternoon.
My pleasure, Gary.
Dan Paull is the CEO of PSMA in Australia. It's 11 minutes to 5.